Chapter 1 of the Dawn of Mediaeval Europe, 476 to 918. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Nagami. The Dawn of Medieval Europe, 476 to 918, by J. H. B. Masterman. Chapter 1. Introduction. The period that we call the Middle Ages extends from the breakup of the Roman Empire in the West in the 5th century to the Renaissance in the 15th, a period of about 1,000 years. The night of this great day of human history may be said to last through the first 300 years, 450 to 750, and the early dawn begins with the events that led to the establishment of the Empire of Charles the Great. The 11th and 12th centuries are the morning, and the 13th the high noon, from which it declines to the afternoon of the 14th century and the evening of the 15th. The Europe of the 5th century was dominated by two influences, the influence of Roman imperialism and that of the Christian Church. Though the empire fell to pieces in the West, it lived on in the East, gradually changing its character, but retaining in its laws and ideals of government the tradition of the imperial organization that Augustus had founded and Diocletian remodeled on a more despotic basis. It is a great mistake to underestimate the influence of the Eastern Empire on Western Europe. Constantinople was not only the frontier fortress of Europe in the East, it was also the home of Roman law and of a civilization that had become Greek in its outer dress, but remained largely Roman in its inner character. But the inheritance of Rome passed on to the New World through two other channels. The Teutonic peoples, who poured into the almost depopulated provinces of the West, came under the spell of Rome. They marched along the roads that Rome had made. They passed as friends or foes by cities that Rome had built. The ambition of their greatest leaders, of men like Alaric or Theodoric, was not to destroy, but to rebuild the Roman world of ordered rule and equal justice. In Gaul and in Italy, the language and ideas of Rome turned the Frank and Lombard conquerors into Frenchmen and Italians. Meanwhile, imperial Rome became papal Rome. When the long centuries of contest between the Church and the Empire closed with the accession of Constantine, the result was not only that the Empire became Christian, but also that the Church became imperial. Soon after, the transference of the imperial court to Constantinople left the Bishop of Rome incomparably the greatest figure in the city by the Tiber. And as Christianity spread through Western Europe, the authority of the Roman See grew constantly wider. So when the bond of a common political organization no longer held Western Europe together, the bond of a common religious organization began to take its place. As inheritor of the imperial tradition, the papacy became not only a religious but also a political power. The claims of the Roman See were at first resented by the Teutonic peoples, who had adopted the Arian form of Christianity from the earliest missionaries who had labored among them. But the conversion of Clovis to Catholic Christianity in 496 marked the beginning of the extension of papal authority over the Teutonic tribes, and the labors of Augustine and his successors in England in the 7th century, and of the great missionary archbishop Boniface in Germany in the 8th, ensured the supremacy of the Pope in the West. Of the Teutonic peoples that remained Arian, the Ostrogoths vanished from history, and the Vandals and Visigoths fell under the sway of the Moslems, the latter soon after they had abandoned the Arian for the Catholic creed. In the East, the claims of the papacy were resisted, not only by the Patriarch of Constantinople, who as Bishop of New Rome claimed to be the equal of the Bishop of Old Rome, but also by the emperors, who asserted their right to exercise over the Church the same autocratic authority that they exercised over the state. The Eastern and Western churches drifted apart, and before the end of the 9th century the separation was almost complete. The Teutonic invaders brought their own contribution to the life of the Middle Ages. The idea of personal liberty that appears in early Teutonic law, the practice of commendation, and the authority of the chief over his comites, the institutions of elective monarchy, and the assemblies of free warriors, exercised a profound influence over the new world that was shaping itself out of the fragments of the old. The reign of Theodoric was the first attempt to harmonize the old and the new, to blend the Roman ideals of order and civilitas with the Teutonic spirit of freedom. The Arianism of the Goths and the opposition of a party among the Roman nobles made the task a difficult one, and with the death of Theodoric and the revival of the Empire under Justinian, the Gothic kingdom crumbled away. But the Empire, confronted by new dangers in the East, first from the aggressions of the Persian kings, and then from the rise of Mohammedanism, could not keep what it had won. 13 years before Heraclius rose to save the Empire, the Lombards had inherited the lands that the Goths had abandoned. The Lombards, contented to rule and extend their territories without any effort to assimilate the native population, remained an aristocracy of nobles settled among a subject people. If the Lombard kings could have conquered Rome as they conquered Ravenna, they might have been able to build up an Italian kingdom through the fusion of Roman and Teutonic institutions and ideas. But the Lombards produced no great leader with enough of the statesman in him to attempt the task in which Theodoric had failed. Perhaps in any case it would have proved impossible, for by the middle of the 8th century Italy was no longer free to shape her own destiny to supremacy. The central fact of the 8th century was the rise of the Franks in Western Europe under the great mayors of the palace. The victory of Charles Martel at Poitiers in 732 rescued the West from the danger of Moslem rule, and the alliance of King Pippin with the Pope in 752 associated the fortunes of the Teutonic world of the north with those of Rome. The Rhine and the Tiber were linked together, and the Rhone and the Po passed under their sway. At last, just as the 8th century ended, the three influences that had been making the new Europe converged, when Charles the Great, as Emperor of the West, became representative in his own person of the union of Roman ecclesiastical and Teutonic ideas. The coronation of Charles was the recognition of the fact that the same man was now the head of the Christian Church, the inheritor of the Roman imperial dignity, and the master of the Teutonic world. But the empire of Charles the Great had in it the seeds of dissolution. Its strength lay in its Teutonic military organization, and as this was founded on the idea of personal service, it broke down with the revival of local feeling. It had the unity of a common ecclesiastical organization, but the attempt to establish a common administrative system failed through the tribal and local antagonisms that awoke as soon as the great emperor was dead. The Frankish judicial system, by which every man was judged by the law of his own nation, prevented the development of a common code of law for the empire. For a time, in the middle of the 10th century, the Holy Roman Empire of Otho the Great seemed destined to realize part at least of the ideal of the Carolingian Empire, but the long struggles of the papacy with the empire, and the resistance of the feudal nobility to the autocratic claims of the kings, supported by Roman civil law, ended at last in the disintegration of the medieval world. But it was not only from within that the empire of Charles was weakened. Enemies from without beset it on every side. Northmen, Magyar, Saracens fell upon it with eager ferocity, and in the 9th century, as in the 6th, the Teutonic system of equal division of inheritance proved fatal to all hope of united resistance. But the partitions of the 9th century differ from those of the 6th in this, that they represent lines of division destined to become permanent. The Romanized West was severed from the more German East. Italy fell away from the north. Aquitaine and Burgundy became for a time partly or wholly independent. The 9th century was a period of confusion and of immeasurable suffering, but through the anarchy of the time the political life of Europe began to shape itself into the form that it was destined to retain to the end of the Middle Ages. Serfdom superseded the older relation of the free villagers to their overlord. The military system of Europe began to be territorial instead of personal. Great fiefs grew under dukes and counts, almost entirely independent of royal authority, and feudal castles rose on every hill on the banks of the Rhine and the Seine. In this rough age the Church was obliged to fight for its own possessions and privileges, while its political power increased, its religious enthusiasm declined. Learning was kept alive, but could make no progress in days of distraction and danger. The religion of the people was strangely compounded of superstition and fear. As the century drew near its end, the clouds began to lift. The Byzantine Empire weathered the storm of Moslem attack. With narrowed frontiers, hemmed in by Slavs and Saracens, it lived on as a civilizing power in the East. In the West also the tide of Saracen conquest began to turn, and southern Italy and northern Spain were recovered from their rule. The Northmen established in the north of England and in the valley of the Seine were no longer mere agents of destruction. A little later they began to rebuild the churches that they had destroyed and re-establish the order that they had disturbed. Along the eastern frontiers of the empire, the raids of the Magyars began to be checked. In 918, the election of Henry, Duke of Saxony, to the throne of Germany brought the period of disintegration in Central Europe to an end, while the rise of the family of Robert the Strong to power in West Francia gave promise of the development of a new France, with Paris as its capital. Another century was destined to pass before the forces of disorder and disintegration were for a time worsted, but by the opening of the 10th century, the old Europe, the Europe of Zeno and Theodoric and Clovis, had dissolved, and the new Europe, the Europe of Otho the Great and Hildebrand and Barbarossa, had begun. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of the Dawn of Mediaeval Europe, 476 to 918, by J.H.B. Masterman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. The Empire in 476. In the year 476, the last emperor in the West was deposed, and the Roman provinces in the West became independent Teutonic kingdoms. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus marks the end of a process of change that had been going on for nearly 3 centuries. At the end of the 2nd century, the northern boundaries of the empire were the Rhine and the Danube. Beyond these rivers lived various Teutonic tribes with whom the Roman emperors carried on a desultory war, not now for the extension of the frontiers, but to keep back the barbarians from penetrating into the empire. The last emperor who extended the northern frontier of the empire was Trajan, who at the beginning of the 2nd century established the province of Dacia north of the Danube. Under his successors, Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, the empire enjoyed nearly half a century of peace and good government. But in the reign of Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180, a change began. The Teutonic peoples had already begun to find their way into the empire, at first as slaves in Roman households or as serfs cultivating frontier lands, and a little later as soldiers in the Roman armies. They now tried to break through the frontiers, not in isolated companies, but in organized tribes, and Marcus Aurelius was the first of a long series of emperors who were obliged to carry on a constant defensive war to hold back tribes of barbarians that were being driven from behind onto the Roman frontiers. In the course of this long contest, the barbarians absorbed a good deal of the civilization and culture of Rome. Many of them enrolled themselves under the standard of the empire, and did loyal service against their fellow Teutons across the borders. In the year 330, Constantine, the first Christian emperor, established a new capital at Byzantium, which he called after his own name, Constantinople. From this time there were generally two emperors, one ruling in the east and the other in the west. The earliest barbarians to gain a foothold in the empire were the Goths. Early in the 3rd century they appeared in the south of Russia, having migrated from the northwest of Europe. They gradually fell into two tribes, the eastern or Ostrogoths and the western or Visigoths. About the year 250 they began to move southward and westward, and came into contact with the empire. 20 years later, a body of them settled in the Roman province of Dacia, and inflicted a great defeat on the Emperor Decius, who perished in the battle. The Emperor Aurelian, in the year 270, made peace with them, allowing them to retain Dacia. For nearly a century after this, the Goths remained at peace with the empire. During this time they learned the art of writing and were converted to the Arian form of Christianity by the efforts of the great missionary bishop Ulfilas. The fact that most of the Teutonic tribes adopted Arianism is important because it imposed a barrier of separation between them and the Roman peoples who were Orthodox. Footnote: Arius was a priest of Alexandria who early in the 4th century taught certain doctrines about the person of our Lord that were declared at the Council of Nicaea in 325 to be erroneous. He and all who agreed with him were excommunicated, and after a struggle of nearly a century, in which Athanasius was the chief leader of the Orthodox party, the empire declared for the Nicene view. End footnote. In the year 376, the Visigoths of Dacia were attacked by a vast horde of Huns from Central Asia, and after vainly trying to withstand them, they petitioned the emperor for leave to cross the Danube and settle in the empire. Valens allowed them to do so, but his impolitic treatment of them led to hostilities and to his defeat and death at the Battle of Adrianople in 378. His successor, Theodosius, made peace with them, but after his death they began to ravage the empire, and finally, under their great king Alaric, they poured into Italy, besieged and sacked Rome, and then, after the death of Alaric, settled in southern Gaul, where a body of Ostrogoths joined them in 473. They gradually extended their conquests into Spain, whence they drove out another Teutonic tribe, the Vandals. The Vandals had for a long time been one of the leading tribes of Germany. They had been driven south by the Goths about the year 330, and had settled in Pannonia. About the year 400 they had marched with allies of Alan and Slavic race into Gaul, and thence, driven perhaps by the Franks, into Spain. When the Visigoths began to advance into Spain, the Vandals, invited by a treacherous Roman governor, crossed to North Africa, where, under their king Genseric or Gaiseric, they ravaged the whole province with merciless cruelty. After the capture of Carthage in 439, the Vandals established themselves as the ruling race, and as they were Arians, they persecuted the Roman Christians of North Africa. Under Genseric they also became the pirate masters of the Mediterranean, and ravaged the coasts of Italy, even sacking Rome itself in 455. Another Teutonic kingdom set up at this time was that of the Burgundians, who under their king Gundobad established themselves in the valleys of the Rhone and Saône about the year 443. Further north, on the banks of the Rhine, lay the kingdom of the Franks, the latest of the great Teutonic peoples to enter the empire. Between these two Teutonic kingdoms lay a semi-independent Roman province with its capital at Soissons, ruled over by a Roman general, Aegidius. On his death in 464, his son Syagrius succeeded. Italy had been, ever since 410, the spoil of contending chieftains, who set up and deposed puppet emperors as they pleased. The last of these puppet emperors, a boy of about 14, was ruling in Rome in 476 under the protection of his father Orestes. In this year a dispute between Orestes and his barbarian followers about the allocation of lands led to a revolt, and the soldiers elected a herule officer, Odoacer or Odovacar, as their chief. Orestes took refuge in Pavia, but was soon captured and beheaded. His little son, who fell into the hands of Odoacer, was spared by the conqueror and allowed to retire to a palace near Naples with a large pension for his maintenance. Of him we hear no more. The year that followed the accession of Odoacer was marked by two events of importance. The first of these was the death of the old pirate king Genseric the Vandal. With him passed away the greatness of the Vandal kingdom, which declined steadily for half a century, till it fell once more under the sway of the Empire. The other event was the arrival at Constantinople of an embassy from the Senate of Rome, who came to inform Zeno, the emperor now ruling in the East, that they did not need a separate emperor, but that Zeno himself, as sole emperor, would suffice for both ends of the earth, that Odoacer, a prudent statesman and brave warrior, had been chosen to defend their interests, and that they requested Zeno to bestow on him the dignity of patrician and entrust to his care the diocese of Italy. To this request Zeno assented, and Odoacer, already virtually the independent sovereign of Italy, now became in name the imperial viceroy in the diocese of Italy. But though the actual authority exercised by the emperor was little more than nominal, it would be a mistake to suppose that the empire in the West was regarded as ended. The idea of the Roman Empire had taken such hold of the imagination of men that it was not regarded as possible that it could end. It lived on as an idea through centuries of contest and confusion, till the time came for an attempt to be made, by the coronation of Charles the Great, to give the idea once more an outward expression. The mention of Zeno takes us from the Western Empire to the East. While the empire in the West had been slowly crumbling into a group of independent Teutonic kingdoms, the empire in the East had been successfully resisting the assaults of the barbarians. The great city of Constantinople was impregnable to assault on the land side, and could not be successfully starved into surrender while the empire retained the command of the sea. The great enemy of the empire in the East had been the Persian Empire, but in the 5th century Persia was not able to do more than carry on a frontier war at intervals. Though the empire had lost its western provinces, the wealth of the provinces of what we now call Asia Minor furnished the emperors with adequate resources till they became impoverished by maladministration and war. In the middle of the 5th century, a barbarian adventurer, Aspar, occupied at Constantinople a position not unlike that of Orestes or Odoacer in Italy. In 457 he raised Leo the Isaurian, official of the court. Isauria is the mountainous district on the north of Mount Taurus between Cilicia and Phrygia. To the imperial throne. Leo repaid his benefactor by procuring his assassination a few years later. On Leo's death in 474 he was succeeded by his son-in-law and fellow countryman Tarasicodissa, who adopted the name of Zeno. Like our English Ethelred the Unready, Zeno is credited with adopting the cowardly policy of buying off the enemies of the empire. Though he seems to have been rather repulsive in personal character, he was not without ability as a ruler. He had constantly to contend with attempts to set rival claimants on the throne, but partly by good luck and partly by the unscrupulous cunning and cruelty that became from this time a characteristic of the Eastern court, he succeeded in retaining the throne till his death in 491. The history of Constantinople during this period is chiefly the record of religious controversies in which the people of the city took sides with great vigour. The two chief factions in the city, adopting the colours of the circus races, called themselves the Blues and the Greens, the former being the champions of orthodoxy, the latter of the Monophysite heresy. The Monophysites held that our Lord had only one nature, the human nature being absorbed in the divine. Under Anastasius, who succeeded on the death of Zeno, these factions became more aggressive, while a war with Persia and inroads of Slavs and Bulgarians from across the Danube disturbed the peace of the empire. Chapter 3 of the Dawn of Mediaeval Europe, 476-918, by J. H. Masterman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. The Rise of Theodoric. The Ostrogoths, who had remained in the district north of the Black Sea while their Visigothic brethren moved southwards, fell in the 5th century under the yoke of the Huns, whom they served for 80 years, till the death of the great Hunnish chief Attila in 454. Then they rose in rebellion, in alliance with the Gepidi and other subject nations, and broke the power of the Huns in a great battle on the banks of the river Netad, probably in Hungary. The situation is not known. Moving southwards, they occupied the province of Pannonia, apparently by friendly arrangement with the Roman authorities. The Ostrogoths were at this time ruled by 3 brothers, descendants of the old Amal family: Walamir, Theudemir, and Widemir. In 454, on the very day on which Walamir repulsed a sudden attack of the Huns and gained a great victory, a son was born to his brother Theudemir and named Theodorix, the ruler of the people, a name changed by the Roman chroniclers to Theodoric. When Theodoric was 7 years old, a war broke out between the Goths and the Empire, owing to an attempt of the Emperor to withhold the usual subsidies. After the Goths had ravaged Moesia, the Emperor agreed to renew the tribute on condition that the Goths confined their ravages to the lands north of the Danube. Theudemir was obliged to surrender his little son as a hostage for the fulfilment of the treaty, and so it came to pass that Theodoric spent 10 years at the court of Constantinople, where the Emperor Leo became warmly attached to him. It is impossible to exaggerate the influence on Theodoric's life of this long residence at the imperial court. To realize it, we must imagine the son of an Indian frontier chief living from the age of 7 to 17 at the British court, watching the administration of justice, the organization of war and commerce, the whole system of British life. At the time of Theodoric's stay there, Constantinople was at the height of its splendour, the most magnificent city of the world. There Theodoric could see men of every nation of the earth, bound together by subjection to the majestic Roman law, laying aside their turbulent independence in the realization of a common citizenship. It was at Constantinople that Theodoric learnt those lessons of the value of orderly rule and legal right that he afterwards strove so hard to teach to his Italian subjects. When at the end of 10 years Theodoric came home, he found the Goths at war with the neighbouring nation of the Suevi, on whom they inflicted a crushing defeat about the year 470. Theodoric celebrated his return by leading an expedition against the Sarmatians, from whose king Babai he wrested the city of Singidunum, Belgrade, which lies at the junction of the Save and the Danube. A tribe like the Goths, who subsisted largely on plunder, and whose Pannonian camping ground was probably exhausted of supplies, could not remain for long at peace. From the diminution of the spoils of the neighbouring nations, says Jordanus, the historian of the Goths began to lack food and clothing, and to those men to whom war had long furnished all their sustenance, peace began to be odious, and all the Goths with loud shouts approached their king, Theudemir, praying him to lead his army whither he would, but to lead it forth to war. The Gothic host divided into two armies, one of which followed Widemir westwards to attack Rome, while the other marched south under Theudemir and Theodoric to ravage Macedonia. Of Widemir's expedition little need be said. He died in Italy without achieving any important success, and his son led his host into Gaul, where it was absorbed in the Visigothic kingdom of southern Gaul. Meanwhile Theudemir plundered Macedonia and laid siege to Thessalonica. Peace was then made with Constantinople, the Goths being allowed to settle in 6 towns of Macedonia and the country around them. Such an arrangement could not last long. Crowded into a little corner of Macedonia, the Goths would be certain to resume before long their habits of wandering and plunder. About 474 Theudemir died, and his son succeeded as king of the Ostrogoths. Soon after, Theodoric's friend, the Emperor Leo, died at Constantinople and was succeeded by his little grandchild Leo, whose death a few months later left Zeno the Isaurian as sole emperor. The history of the next 14 years of the life of Theodoric is complicated by the presence on the scene of another Theodoric, a Gothic chief related by marriage with the barbarian Aspar, who had for years played the part of kingmaker at Constantinople till his murder by Leo in 471. This Theodoric, son of Triarius, first becomes important about 473, when he wrested a treaty from Leo by which he was to enjoy the title of Magister Equitum et Peditum, and receive a yearly subsidy of 2,000 pounds of gold in return for the services of himself and his warriors. Soon after the accession of Zeno, a pretender Basilicus rose in revolt, supported by Theodoric, son of Triarius. But after nearly 2 years of exile, Zeno returned to Constantinople and ousted his rival, who was sent away to die of hunger in a fortress of Cappadocia. Theodoric the Amal, who had supported the cause of Zeno, now became patrician and master of the soldiery, titles of great honour in the empire. War followed between the two Theodorics, but when their armies came face to face, they fraternized instead of fighting, and the two chiefs made common cause against the emperor. After various negotiations too tedious to relate, Zeno succeeded in detaching Theodoric, son of Triarius, from his alliance with the Amal chief, and Theodoric the Amal led his followers to another raid into Macedonia, which they had abandoned some years before for the lands at the mouth of the Danube. From Macedonia the Gothic host passed over the mountains into Epirus, then back again into the Balkan district. It would be too long and too unprofitable a task to follow Theodoric through the wanderings and wars of the years that followed. In 481 his namesake and rival died, and soon after the remnant of his followers joined the rest of the Goths under the standard of the Amal chief. For some years after this the Goths wandered aimlessly about the frontiers of the empire, sometimes at peace with the emperor, sometimes ravaging his territories. The supreme problem was how to find food for the nation in lands gradually growing depopulated by war and famine. The host moved to and fro with its women and children in the wagons that followed the army. It was a gigantic gypsy caravan, this Gothic nation on the march, hungry, fierce, and merciless. During all this time Odoacer was ruling in Italy. His relations with the emperor were at first friendly, but the conquest of Dalmatia, which brought the frontiers of the Italian kingdom further eastwards, and still more help given by Odoacer to an imperial general, Ilus, who rose in unsuccessful insurrection against Zeno, led to the outbreak of hostilities between the Italian king and the empire. Zeno's first step was to encourage the king of the Rugians, a powerful tribe on the Danube, to attack Odoacer. The attack failed, and the defeated Rugian king Frederick fled to the camp of Theodoric. Zeno then turned to Theodoric, who was in no wise unwilling to lead his people into the fertile lands of Italy. So in the autumn of 498 the Goths set out on this new adventure. They fought their way along the highlands of Pannonia and Noricum, and closed this part of the expedition with a great battle against the Gepidi, a battle that broke the power of that nation and replenished the waggons of the Goths with great stores of provisions. They descended without resistance into the plains of Italy, to find Odoacer and his army drawn up to meet them near Aquileia. They scattered his army in flight, and took possession of the whole of north-eastern Italy as far as the Adige, Odoacer falling back on Verona, where he gathered what was left of his army into an entrenched camp. After a terrific contest, the Gothic warriors, led by Theodoric in person, broke the forces of Odoacer and drove him back to Ravenna, where among the marshes the defeated king made his last stand. The siege of Ravenna went on for more than 3 years, and in the meanwhile Theodoric had to fight more than one enemy to retain his hold over northern Italy. The first of these enemies was Tufa, who had been one of Odoacer's chief lieutenants, and who accepted, or appeared to accept, the leadership of Theodoric. So confident was Theodoric in his fidelity that he entrusted to his command the army he sent to attack Ravenna. Like Marshal Ney, Tufa's new loyalty could not stand the strain of immediate contact with his old leader, and with most of his troops he went over to the side of Odoacer. The officers who refused to desert Theodoric were surrendered to Odoacer, who ruthlessly murdered them all. Perhaps encouraged by Tufa's treachery, Frederick, the Rugian king, who had followed the standards of Theodoric into Italy, broke with his leader and began to ravage Italy on his own account. For a time things looked black for Theodoric, but the allies soon quarrelled, and Tufa was slain in a battle near Verona. Frederick threw himself into Pavia, which he held for 2 years. His fate we do not know. Then from across the Alps a fresh antagonist appeared to challenge the right of the Ostrogoths to their new kingdom. Gundobad, king of the Burgundians, marched into Italy, nominally as the ally of Odoacer. Near Milan, Theodoric, with the help of the Visigothic king Alaric II, met and vanquished the coalition, and drove Odoacer back to Ravenna. The siege of Ravenna now went on without interruption, and as Theodoric was able to control the harbour by means of his fleet, the city was soon in dire straits. At last Odoacer was obliged to own himself beaten, and a treaty was made between the two rival kings by which they were to rule Italy together. Probably neither party intended to hold to so impossible an arrangement, and the chroniclers who desire to justify Theodoric tell us that Odoacer was plotting against the life of his successful rival. Theodoric may have believed that this was so, but nothing can excuse the act that followed, and which remains the greatest blot on the character of the great Ostrogoth. Inviting his fallen rival to a banquet on the 15th of March, 493, he entrusted to some soldiers, hidden in an alcove, the task of murdering him. When their courage failed at the critical moment, Theodoric himself struck down the king with one tremendous stroke, shouting as he smote, "This is what you did to my friends." Thus, by one foul deed, Theodoric rid himself of his last rival, and stood the unchallenged master of the Italy that he had won. After the long strife of contending chiefs, the possibility of a new empire in the West seemed to have returned. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of the Dawn of Medieval Europe, 476 to 918, by J.H.B. Masterman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. The Gothic Kingdom in Italy. Theodoric was about 40 years of age when he began to reign as the sole king in Italy, and he reigned there for rather more than 30 years. After 20 years of wandering and war, the Ostrogoths settled down to 30 years of almost uninterrupted peace. It was no easy task that confronted the new master of Italy. Not only had he to repair the ravages of long years of desolating strife, he had also to train Gothic and Roman subjects to live at peace together, and Arian as he was, to win the support of the Catholic clergy, on whose goodwill the success of his rule must largely depend. That he succeeded in doing both these things is the most striking evidence of his greatness. Though Theodoric had won Italy by right of conquest, he tried to give legal sanction to his rule. He seems to have secured the confirmation of his kingship from his Ostrogothic followers. He also sent to the emperor at Constantinople for the ratification of his title. Zeno's death in 491 delayed the negotiations, and it was not until 6 years later that Anastasius gave a vague recognition to Theodoric's kingship. As king of the Goths and Romans, for that was probably his title, Theodoric was, for all practical purposes, absolute monarch of Italy. But in the background were the undefined claims of the emperor to supremacy, destined to be reasserted as soon as death had removed the strong hand of the Gothic king from the helm. The recognition of his position by the emperor brought strength to Theodoric's rule, because it commended that rule to the Romans, and so enabled him to secure the help of Roman officials in the difficult work of organizing the kingdom. The vigorous initiative that the Goths had learnt in their long fight for subsistence was now linked with the traditions of authority and ordered rule that had lasted on in Italy through all the confused strife of the last 100 years. Under strong and good government, Italy began to recover her prosperity. Trade developed, agriculture revived, so that Italy was able to export corn instead of importing it. At Rome and at Ravenna, which Theodoric made his capital, great aqueducts were made to supply fresh water. Roads were improved, and the great cities of Italy were once more adorned with works of art and defended by strong walls. All this work of administration went on under the eye of Theodoric, who had something of Napoleon's marvellous power of supervising all the details of administration. But he was also served by a well-organized body of officials, from the great officers of the state, the illustres, as they were called, down to the junior clerks, policemen, and others who stood on the bottom rung of the ladder up which they might hope to climb to higher office. Of Theodoric's officers of state, the best known is Magnus Aurelius Cassiodorus. Sprung from an old official family, Cassiodorus entered public life under his father, who was praetorian prefect, about the year 500. He is said to have won the favour of Theodoric by an eloquent oration delivered on the occasion of a visit of the king to Rome, and was appointed as quaestor, or public orator. He acted for years as the king's secretary, and his legal training and knowledge of Latin literature must have made him a useful adviser. He wrote a history of the Goths in 12 books that have perished, and collected his letters and state papers into 12 books of Varii, which remain and form one of the most valuable sources of information for the reign of Theodoric. He survived his master and became praetorian prefect under his successor in 533. After the fall of the Gothic kingdom, he retired to the monastery of Viviers, which he founded, and there we lose sight of him. During the greater part of Theodoric's reign, the internal affairs of the kingdom provide little material for the chroniclers. 8 years after his accession, he paid his first and only visit to Rome, where he stayed for 6 months and provided splendid entertainments for the pleasure-loving people. But his capital was not Rome, but Ravenna. Here he could better keep in touch with his Gothic followers, who settled chiefly in northern Italy, and was also within easy reach of the northern frontier in case the need arose for meeting a hostile invasion. The Gothic warriors were allotted a third of the lands of Italy, for the most part the same lands that Odoacer's followers had held. Liberius, an old officer of Odoacer, was appointed by Theodoric to arrange the allotment of lands. The Goths lived apparently in small groups, not mixing much with the native Italians, with whom, however, their relations seem to have been quite friendly. Special officers, comites Gothorum, administered Gothic law in all cases between Goths. Where any case arose between a Goth and a Roman lawyer was associated with the Gothic officer in deciding it. Theodoric's Roman subjects were under Roman law, administered by Roman officials. Though Theodoric was an Arian, he remained till near the end of his reign on friendly terms with the Catholic clergy. Soon after his accession he was called to decide between two rival candidates for the papacy, and on his visit to Rome he gave splendid gifts to the shrine of St. Peter. The same spirit of toleration led him to take the Jews under his protection, and when, near the end of his life, the synagogues at Rome and Ravenna were burnt in a riot, he insisted on the punishment of the rioters and the reconstruction of the buildings. The external affairs of the reign turn around Theodoric's relations with the Teutonic kingdoms of the West and with the Empire. Of the kingdoms beyond the Alps, the largest and most important at the time of Theodoric's accession was the Visigothic kingdom that included southern France and most of Spain. The ruler of this kingdom was Alaric II, who succeeded to the throne in 485. Though an Arian, he tried, like Theodoric, to propitiate the Catholic clergy in his dominions. With Theodoric, the Visigoths remained on terms of close alliance, and Alaric married a daughter of the Ostrogothic king. This was the beginning of a series of matrimonial alliances between the house of Theodoric and the neighbouring rulers. His sister, Amalafrida, married Thrasamund, the Vandal king of North Africa, and one of his daughters was given in marriage to Sigismund, son of the Burgundian king Gundobad. Theodoric himself married Augofleda, sister of Clovis, the king of the Franks. The story of the rise of Clovis will be told in another chapter. It only concerns us now in its influence on the policy of Theodoric. At first he attempted to maintain friendly relations with the Frankish king, but when Clovis began to prepare for an attack on his ally, the king of the Visigoths, he remonstrated in vain. In the war that followed, Alaric was defeated and slain before Theodoric's army arrived to help him. Some years of war followed between Theodoric and Clovis, ending in a severe defeat of Clovis by the Ostrogoths. Theodoric and the Frankish king then agreed to partition the dominions of Alaric, Clovis taking most of southern Gaul and Theodoric Provence. Then Spain, the one remaining Visigothic province, becomes for a time the centre of Theodoric's policy. On the death of Alaric, an illegitimate son, Gesalic, was proclaimed as king by some of the Visigoths. He was defeated by the Burgundians and fled to Carthage, where Thrasamund espoused his cause for a time, till Theodoric's protests obliged him to dismiss the fugitive. Ultimately, Gesaric was captured in Gaul by Theodoric's soldiers and put to death. There remained only one heir of the house of Alaric, his little son Amalaric, grandson of Theodoric. With the consent of the Visigoths, Theodoric acted as regent in Spain for the young king, and thus practically added Spain to his other dominions. We now turn to Theodoric's relations with the Empire. On the death of Zeno, Anastasius succeeded as emperor, and though over 60 at the time of his accession, reigned for 25 years in Constantinople. The theological controversies in which he was involved during the greater part of his reign, and in which he took the side that lost for him the support and sympathy of the popes, tended to sever the East from the West. A desultory war that broke out between the Gothic kingdom and the Empire in consequence of Theodoric's annexation of Sirmium in Illyria ended in 509, and while Anastasius lived, friendly relations were maintained between the two courts. But when Justin succeeded as emperor and became reconciled to the Pope, the fear that the emperor might manifest his orthodoxy by inaugurating a persecution of the Arians in the East led to friction between him and Theodoric. In the year 525, when this policy of persecution began, Theodoric sent Pope John I to Constantinople to remonstrate with the emperor. The pope was accorded a splendid welcome at Constantinople and officiated at a magnificent coronation of the new emperor. How far he succeeded in winning any toleration for the Arian subjects of the empire is not clear. What is clear is that the result of the visit was to demonstrate the alliance between pope and emperor in a way which Theodoric never intended. When John returned, he found the king passionately indignant, and the pope was thrown into prison, where he died soon after, 25th of May, 526. The closing years of the reign of Theodoric are a rather sad contrast to the prosperity and wise government of the earlier time. His only child was a daughter, Amalasuntha, and about the year 515 Theodoric married her to a young Goth from Spain, Eutharic. Eutharic was a strong Arian, and his influence over his father-in-law appears to have led him to adopt a less friendly attitude toward his Catholic subjects just at the very time when the Eastern court was inclined to press more hardly on the Arians. The effect of all this was that the good relations that had for so long subsisted between Theodoric and his Roman subjects began to give place to an attitude of mutual suspicion. The chief of the Senate, Caput Senatus, at this time was Symmachus, a Roman noble of illustrious ancestry, great wealth and high reputation. With him was associated a younger man, Boethius, who had been placed under the care of Symmachus in early life, and had married his daughter Rusticiana. Boethius enjoyed the confidence of Theodoric, and in 522 his two little sons were made consuls, an honour that Boethius repaid by a great oration in praise of the king. But now Theodoric's attitude changed. Throughout Western Europe the Arian cause was losing ground, for the Frankish kingdom was still growing, and the Burgundian and Vandal kingdoms had passed into the hands of Catholic rulers. Just at this juncture an officer of Theodoric's court, Cyprian, who held a position not unlike that of public prosecutor, accused a Roman noble named Albinus of treasonable correspondence with the emperor. It is impossible to say whether Cyprian was acting from patriotic or personal motives, but his accusation was strongly resented, not only by Albinus but by Boethius, who warmly espoused the cause of his friend. Whatever Albinus did, he said, I and the whole Senate of Rome did the same. Cyprian, thus challenged, replied by charging Boethius with treason and procuring his arrest. In the events that followed there is much that is obscure. The exact nature of the charges against Boethius is uncertain. What is certain is that he was not accorded a fair trial. He was condemned by his fellow senators without being heard in his own defence, and sentence of death was passed against him. After some months in prison he was executed. The name of Boethius is remembered now not only as almost the last great Roman, but even more as the author of a book written in prison during the last few weeks of his life, the famous Consolations of Philosophy. The purpose of the book, which is in prose with poems interspersed here and there, is to explain how, after the Muses had vainly tried to comfort the prisoner, Philosophy, appearing in the guise of a tall and beautiful woman, came to him and spoke of the vanity of human hopes and the satisfaction to be found in resting in God. There is nothing distinctly Christian in the book, though Boethius himself was a Christian. It is the last word of the old Stoic world of Marcus Aurelius and Seneca. As a textbook of philosophy, the book became one of the most cherished possessions of the early Middle Ages. It was translated into English by Alfred the Great and into most of the other languages of Europe. The mission of Pope John followed almost immediately after the death of Boethius, and before the death of the Pope, Symmachus had been accused and executed. Theodoric had declared war on his Roman subjects, and it is hard to say what the issue of the contest would have been. But before Theodoric could put into execution an edict ordering the churches throughout Italy to be handed over to the Arians, he was stricken with mortal disease and died on the 30th of August, 526. He is said to have bitterly lamented on his deathbed the acts of violence that had stained the last years of his life. Many historians are disposed to account for them by the theory that Theodoric had in these last years become partially insane. Certainly it is not easy on any other theory to explain the extraordinary transformation in his character. Theodoric was buried at Ravenna, where his tomb still stands. But the porphyry vase that held his remains has vanished long ago, like the Gothic kingdom that he tried to establish. The history of the decline and fall of that kingdom can be told only in outline. Eutharic had died long before his father-in-law, and the throne passed to his little son Athalaric, for whom Amalasuentha acted as regent, with Cassiodorus as chief adviser. But Amalasuentha, whose sympathies were with her Roman subjects rather than with the ruder Gothic warriors, alienated the Goths by attempting to give her son the education of a Roman lawyer instead of that of a Gothic chief. After a time he escaped from her tutelage, only to ruin himself with self-indulgence and to die at the age of 18 in 534. Amalasuentha then invited the only surviving relation of the late king, Theodahad, to become her colleague on the throne. He accepted the offer, and almost at once deposed Amalasuentha, who soon after perished at the hands of a disaffected party of Gothic nobles. But now a new power appears on the scene. The story of the revival of the empire will be told in a later chapter. By the year 535, Justinian, having completed the conquest of North Africa, was ready to profit by the confusion in Italy and to make good the claims of the empire to those Italian lands that the emperors had never ceased to regard as part of their dominions. By the year 536, Justinian's generals had wrested Dalmatia from the Goths, and the greatest of his commanders, Belisarius, had landed in Italy and captured the island with little difficulty. In the spring of this year Belisarius crossed into southern Italy, and the long death agony of the Gothic kingdom began. With the fall of Naples, all southern Italy passed into the hands of the imperial general. The Goths then, in a great national assembly, deposed the worthless Theodahad, who was hunted down and slain on the way to Ravenna. In his place a veteran Gothic warrior, Witigis, was raised on the shields of the Goths as their king. But the imperial cause still prospered. Witigis withdrew northwards, leaving only a small garrison in Rome, and on the approach of Belisarius this garrison marched out of the city, which Belisarius occupied, fortified, and victualled. He had rightly judged that the Goths would soon repent of their mistake in abandoning Rome. By the spring of 537, Witigis marched south at the head of the whole Gothic army, and after a tremendous contest outside the walls of the city, shut up Belisarius and his forces in Rome. A year's siege followed, marked by infinite resourcefulness on the part of the imperial general, and much strenuous fighting on the part of the Goths. But in March 538 the Goths broke up their encampments, where they had suffered grievously from disease, and marched north to meet an attack on Ravenna by a fresh imperial force. It took Belisarius 2 more years of hard fighting to reach Ravenna, which he blockaded. He is said to have won the city by pretending to agree to a proposal of the Goths that he should himself accept the throne of Italy. Witigis was sent as a prisoner to Constantinople, and Ravenna became and remained for 200 years the centre of imperial rule in Italy. Just at this juncture Belisarius was recalled by the emperor, and the administration of the newly recovered province of Italy fell into the hands of a body of rapacious and often incompetent Byzantine officials, men who oppressed and robbed with impartial injustice the soldiers of Belisarius, and the native nobles of Italy. At this time the position of the Goths seemed desperate. Many of them had submitted to the Empire, and the irreconcilable remnant had retired to the one remaining stronghold in Italy, the city of Ticinum, Pavia. Here they chose Ildibad as their king. After a time his scanty forces began to be augmented by deserters from the imperial army, and before the end of the year 540 he was able to take the offensive and win a great victory at Treviso, which gave back most of northern Italy to the Goths. A short period of internal dissensions checked for a time the rising tide of Gothic success. Ildibad was murdered by the adherents of a rival faction, and his successor Eraric was in his turn slain. Then, in the autumn of 541, the last great hero of the Gothic race was elected as king. He was the nephew of Ildibad, and is known to the Greek chroniclers of the time as Totila, though his real name appears to have been Baduila. His reign of 11 years forms a splendid close to the story of Ostrogothic rule in Italy. Totila knew that his chance of regaining Italy depended on his securing and retaining the goodwill of the Italian people, alienated by the exactions of the tax-gatherers of Justinian. He therefore repressed plundering among his soldiers, and contented himself with levying from the people the taxes that they would have had to pay to the imperial officers. So successful was this policy that within 2 years of his accession he had reconquered the whole of Italy, with the exception of a few cities, of which the most important were Ravenna and Rome. Alarmed at this sudden change, Justinian sent Belisarius, who had for some time been in disfavour at court, back to Italy with very inadequate resources, to reconquer the lost province. In the 5 years of desultory war that followed, Belisarius did nothing worthy of his great reputation, excepting his occupation and defence of Rome. Totila had blockaded Rome, which was defended by a small imperial force, and after a brave but unsuccessful attempt by Belisarius to break the boom that Totila had placed across the river Tiber to prevent fresh provisions coming into the city by sea, a part of the garrison betrayed the city to Totila, who entered without any resistance, the imperial troops marching out on the other side. It is said that Totila at first proposed to raze the whole city to the ground, but was persuaded by the entreaties of his great antagonist Belisarius to abandon the idea. Instead, he tore large gaps in the walls so as to make the city indefensible, and then marched away, leaving it deserted and not allowing a single human being to remain behind. Into the deserted city Belisarius with 1,000 soldiers marched about a month later, and within 25 days he had rendered it once more defensible, with hastily constructed walls rudely heaped together. After one vain effort to regain the city, Totila and his Goths marched away, leaving the imperial general entrenched among the ruins of the city that had once been the mistress of the world. 2 years later, when Belisarius had been recalled from Italy, Totila succeeded, through the treachery of part of the garrison, in once more making himself master of Rome, and he now invited the Roman nobles to return to the city and tried to repair the ravages of war. Meanwhile the emperor determined on one last effort to win back Italy. His grand chamberlain, Narses, a man already over 70 years of age, was placed in command of a great host of barbarians, attracted to his standard by the hope of the plunder of Italy. He marched overland and arrived at Ravenna without encountering any resistance. But a little farther south he met the army of Totila, and a great battle ended in the complete defeat of the Goths, who were outnumbered and perhaps outgeneralled. Totila was slain as he was flying from the field. The end of the Goths had come. For a few months a new leader, Teias, strove to make headway against the power of the empire, but town after town surrendered to Narses, and at length the remnant of the Gothic army was hemmed in near Naples, and after vainly seeking refuge in the rocky fastnesses of Mons Lactarius, they made one last desperate attack on the imperial forces. After 2 days of hand-to-hand combat, during which Teias was slain, the Goths offered to leave Italy and find a home in some barbarian kingdom. Their terms were accepted, and they marched across the passes of the Alps and vanished, we know not whither. Theodoric's great attempt to build up a kingdom of Italy by welding together Roman and Teuton under his sway had failed. 13 centuries were destined to pass before the royal house of Savoy achieved the goal that the great Ostrogoth had failed to reach. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Dawn of Medieval Europe, 476 to 918, by J.H.B. Masterman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 5. The Rise of the Franks. Among the latest of the Teutonic peoples to cross the frontiers of the empire was the tribe, or rather confederation of tribes, to whom the Romans gave the name of Franks. Footnote: the origin of the name is uncertain. The two most probable explanations are: number 1, that the name was derived from a Celtic or Breton word, franc, meaning open and so free. 2, that it was derived from a Teutonic word, franki, meaning ferocious. End footnote. They came from the Thuringian forest district, where a river called the Sala or Sal, a tributary of the Maine, flows across the land still known as the Unterfranken. It was probably from this river that they, or part of them, acquired the name of the Salian Franks. We first hear of Frankish inroads across the Rhine about the year 250. From this time they were constantly crossing the frontier, either as raiders to plunder the Roman cities, or as allies to enroll themselves in the imperial armies. In the 5th century the Franks fell into 3 sections. There were the Franks, who remained near the cradle lands of the race in Thuringia, those who settled along the middle Rhine, and who were called the Ripuarian Franks, and those who moved farther north and occupied those lands north of the Roman province of Gaul that were afterwards called the Low Countries. Early in the 5th century these northern Franks, under a chief named Clodion, moved southward and drove the Roman garrison out of Cambrai in 445. Clodion then seized Tournai, which became the capital of a new Frankish kingdom. His successor, Merowig, who is said to have taken his part in the great battle of Chalons that drove Attila out of Gaul, died about 457 and was succeeded by his son Childeric. Legend and history are probably blended in these earlier chapters in the history of the Merovingian house, but with the accession of Childeric's son Clovis in 481, the history of the Frankish kingdom really begins. When Clovis succeeded to his father's throne, his kingdom was one of 4 little Frankish kingdoms in northern Gaul. Siegbert was king of the Ripuarian Franks, with his capital at Cologne. Ragnakar ruled at Cambrai, Cararic at Terouenne, and Clovis at Tournai. Further south in the valley of the Seine was the one district of Gaul still under Roman rule, the independent kingdom of Soissons, which Aegidius had founded and which was now ruled by his son Syagrius. Aegidius was an old enemy of the Franks, and it was not long before the young Frankish king found an excuse for attacking Syagrius. In alliance with Ragnakar of Cambrai, Clovis marched against him, defeated him in a great battle near Soissons, and drove him out of his kingdom. South of the Loire lay the great kingdom of Euric the Visigoth, who had died in 485, leaving a son, Alaric, a boy of about 16 years of age, to succeed him. To Alaric, Syagrius fled for refuge, but on the demand of Clovis, the Visigoths delivered up their guest, who was promptly murdered by the Franks. The whole kingdom of Syagrius, including the city of Paris, fell to Clovis. In 491 Clovis marched against and subdued a tribe of Ripuarian Franks, and so extended his dominions to the borders of Siegbert of Cologne, with whom for the time he remained on friendly terms. This southward extension of Clovis's kingdom brought him into contact with 2 important tribes, the Burgundians in the south, and the Alemanni in the east. With the former of these he entered into friendly relations, and married Clotilda, the niece of the reigning king Gundobad. Gundobad was an Arian, but his niece had been converted to the Catholic faith, and Clovis, who was a pagan as yet, was drawn by her influence in the direction of Orthodox Christianity. The actual conversion of Clovis is connected with an expedition against the Alemanni, a confederation of Teutonic tribes who had settled in the lands watered by the Men and the Neckar. It is said that Clovis, hard pressed in a fight at Tolbiac, prayed to the Christ whom his wife worshipped to give him victory, and that while he prayed his enemies broke and fled. Whatever truth there may be in the story, it is certain that in 496 Clovis was baptized at Reims, the old ecclesiastical capital of northern Gaul, by the aged bishop Remigius. The bishop was attended by most of the bishops of the province, while Clovis brought with him 3,000 Frankish warriors to be baptized with him. Gregory of Tours has recorded Remigius' famous speech to the king: "Bow thy neck, Sicambrian, adore what thou hast burned, and burn what thou hast adored. Mitis te pone colla, Sicamber, adora quod incendisti, incende quod adorasti." The baptism of Clovis is one of the most important turning points in European history. How much sincere conviction had to do with the acceptance of Christianity it is impossible to say. Certainly Christian virtues are not conspicuous in his afterlife, but as a political step his alliance with the Catholic Church was a most sagacious move in the struggle for power going on between the various Teutonic chiefs of Western Europe, for it threw all the influence of the Catholic clergy on the side of the Franks. The kings of the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Vandals, and Burgundians were Arians, and however tolerant they might be, there could be no real cooperation between them and the Orthodox clergy. But when Clovis led his people into the fold of the Church, a new alliance began between the Frankish kings and the Roman Church, an alliance that was destined more than any other event of history to shape the ideas and institutions of medieval Europe. As Bishop Avitus of Vienne said, writing to Clovis soon after his baptism, "Wherever you fight in these lands, it is we, the Church, who conquer." The first result of Clovis's baptism was the establishment of friendly relations with the cities of Brittany, which had hitherto withstood his efforts to gain control over them. Soon after, a domestic quarrel in the Burgundian royal house gave the Frankish king an opportunity. Godegisil, brother of King Gundobad, sent to Clovis, offering, as later feudal language would have expressed it, to hold the kingdom of Burgundy of him if he would help him to drive out his brother. Nothing loath, Clovis marched into Burgundy, and Gundobad fled to Avignon. But for some reason that is not clear, Clovis withdrew his forces soon after, and Gundobad returned, and having put his brother to death, resumed the kingship. But if Clovis failed in Burgundy, he soon extended his kingdom in another direction. About the year 503, he was again at war with the Alemanni. He drove them from their lands by the Men and the Neckar, and settled his Frankish followers in their place. The Alemanni fled into the territories of Theodoric, who took them under his protection and forbade Clovis to pursue them further. They settled in the district that roughly corresponds to the modern states of Württemberg and Baden and part of Switzerland, a district of which we shall later hear again as the Duchy of Alemannia or Swabia. The Burgundian War is important chiefly because it led to an alliance of Arian kings under the leadership of Theodoric to check the growing power of the Franks. If the allies had joined in an attack on the dominions of Clovis, it would have gone hard with the Frankish king, but Theodoric was anxious for peace, and without his help the other kings were not strong enough to attack the Franks. The initiative came from the Franks. In 507 Clovis assembled his warriors and announced to them, "I take it ill that these Arians should hold any part of Gaul. Let us go out with God's help and overthrow them, and bring their land under our sway." The proposal was promptly welcomed, and the Franks marched to attack the Visigoths. Alaric, rashly taking the offensive without waiting for Theodoric's troops to come to his help, was defeated and slain in a great battle near Poitiers. The prize of the victory was almost all the Visigothic kingdom north of the Pyrenees, including the great cities of Bordeaux and Toulouse. After this success, Clovis returned home, leaving his son Theodoric in alliance with Gundobad and the Burgundians, who had gone over to his side, to press the siege of Arles, which held out successfully for nearly 2 years, till relieved by the Ostrogoths in 510. In that year a great army under the command of Count Ibis, one of Theodoric's best generals, crossed the Alps and inflicted a decisive defeat on the Franks and Burgundians. The war ended, as already mentioned, in a compromise between Clovis and Theodoric. Meanwhile, Anastasius had rewarded Clovis's attack on the Arian kingdom of the Visigoths by bestowing on him the consular office, and at Tours the Frankish king was invested with the purple tunic and mantle of a Roman official. The last 2 years of Clovis's life and reign, 509 to 511, were, according to Gregory of Tours, filled with crime and bloodshed. His first victim was the aged king of the Ripuarian Franks, who was murdered by his son Cloderic, it is said, at Clovis's instigation. Cloderic, in his turn, was slain by some messengers of Clovis, and the king himself then came to Cologne and was elected as ruler of the Ripuarian kingdom. Cararic, king of the Frankish kingdom of Terouenne, was then seized and murdered, and his kingdom annexed by Clovis. Ragnakar of Cambrai soon after shared the same fate. Thus the whole Frankish district of northern Gaul passed into the hands of Clovis, who died in Paris in the year 511 at the age of 45, leaving his kingdom to be divided between his 4 sons. At this point it will be convenient to say something about the organization of the Frankish kingdom. The Franks, like the other German tribes who found their way into the empire, brought with them the same Teutonic system of government that Tacitus describes in his Germania 300 years before. At the head of the tribes or nation was the king, elected by the armed warriors as their leader. His person was protected by special penalties, and certain lands were assigned to him for his maintenance. His actual power must have varied much. A king like Clovis, skilled in war and statecraft, was probably nearly autocratic, but a weaker king might easily be little more than a tool in the hands of his nobles. One change that followed on the migration of the tribes was that the king gradually came to be thought of as the owner of the territories that he ruled. It followed that the same law of inheritance that held good for the lands of the nobles came to be applied to the kingdom. The Frank system of inheritance was equal division between all the male descendants of the family. Accordingly, we shall find that on the death of a Frankish king, his kingdom was divided among his sons, an arrangement that gave rise to continual contests. Even earlier than this, the kingly office had generally become restricted to some noble family, descended generally from some hero of the national history, some Amal or Meroving or Cerdic. Next in power to the king stood the nobles. In the primitive Teutonic constitutions these formed a council, by whom the king was advised and by whose influence his power was held in check. But migration and war raised to power among the Teutonic peoples a new class of warrior nobles, the Thanes of the king, whose interest it was rather to exalt than to curb the power of the king. Below the nobles were the free warriors of the tribe, who assembled 2 or 3 times a year for consultation over such questions as peace and war, and for important judicial business. As the Frankish kingdom grew in extent, such meetings must have become less frequent, and the actual share of the armed warrior in the work of government much less. Below the armed warrior class there grew up 2 other classes, the class of serfs, often perhaps conquered peoples, who were allowed to retain certain right in return for labour on the land of their overlord, and the class of slaves, whose lot appears to have grown harder when the Teutonic peoples came under the influence of Roman legal ideas. The Franks, like the other Teutonic peoples, brought with them into the Empire a body of unwritten customary law. This law, modified by local conditions, was after a time written in Latin in a number of codes, of which the most famous is the Salian or Salic code. This code was compiled before the conversion of the Franks to Christianity, but contains later additions by Clovis and his successors. The code consists of regulations about judicial procedure and statements of the Wehrgeld, or compensation payable for various classes of offences. The Wehrgeld for slaying a Frankish freeman was 200 solidi, for a serf, letus, 100 solidi. A Roman was reckoned as equal to a serf, with a Wehrgeld of 100 solidi, while that of a slave was about 30 solidi. The chief officers of the state next to the king were the grafio, count, who ruled over a pagus or shire, then the secebaro, or ruler of 100, and the tunginus, apparently a popularly elected officer of the 100. The Salian code also contains regulations for trial by ordeal, a method of trial that the Church, in those early days, encouraged in cases where no evidence of a decisive kind was forthcoming. The Salian law shows us the legal system of the Franks, just as it comes into contact with the Roman law and the law of the Church. Both these were destined to influence deeply the development of Frankish institutions, as we shall see later. In Gaul, the Franks found at least two peoples of earlier settlement. The Gauls, a Celtic race, formed of the peasantry of the conquered lands. They were not exterminated or driven out as the Britons were by the Anglo-Saxon invaders of this country, but became hewers of wood and drawers of water to their conquerors. Above these were the Romanized inhabitants, men of many races who had settled in the empire at an earlier time and had become Roman in language and ideas. Between these and the newcomers friendly relations gradually grew up, and the influence of this Roman civilization modified by degrees the language and character of the Franks of the West, while those who remained on the other side of the Rhine retained their Teutonic language and customs. The history of the Frankish kingdoms after the death of Clovis can be told only in outline. His empire, for such it had really become, was parcelled out by his sons into 4 kingdoms, having their capitals at Metz, Orléans, Paris, and Soissons. The period that follows is marked by the extension of the frontiers of the Merovingian lands and by constant struggles between the members of the royal house, struggles in which murder plays as large a part as open contest. Theodoric, Clovis' eldest son, to whom the kingdom of Metz had fallen, carried his frontiers eastwards into Thuringia and to the banks of the Danube. Meanwhile, the other 3 brothers joined in an attack on Burgundy, which was absorbed into the Frankish kingdom in 534. A little later, Theodebert, son of Theodoric of Metz, overran and conquered from the Ostrogoths the old Roman province of Provence, and so brought the Frankish realm to the shores of the Mediterranean. During all this time, internal feuds went on between the brothers and nephews, till in 558 Clotaire of Soissons became the sole survivor of the Merovingian house and reunited under one rule all the possessions of the Frankish family. He died in 561, almost his last public act having been to capture his son Cromnus, who had rebelled against him, and burn him alive with all his family. Clotaire left 4 sons, who again partitioned the Frankish realm, and now 2 new figures appear upon the scene, where they were destined to play the leading parts in a ferocious and bloodthirsty drama. The first of these was Brunhilda, a daughter of the Visigothic king of Spain, who became the wife of Siegbert of Metz. The other was Fredegonda. Audovera, wife of Chilperic of Soissons, brought her to the court as her maid, but she succeeded in inducing the king to repudiate his wife. He then married Brunhilda's sister, but Fredegonda after a time secured her murder and succeeded to her place as queen at Soissons. Brunhilda naturally regarded the upstart murderess with deadly hatred. War followed between the 2 kings, but Fredegonda, having secured the assassination of Siegbert at the moment of victory, murdered one by one all the children of her husband, excepting her own son Clotaire, and then finally her husband himself. Meanwhile, a series of events too complicated to tell in detail placed Childebert, Brunhilde's son, on the thrones of Paris, Orleans, and Burgundy in 593. Years of war followed, during which the authority of the surviving kings of the Merovingian house over the vassals declined. Childebert died in 596, leaving Brunhilde as regent for his two little sons. Next year Fredegunda also died, just as her plan for uniting all the Franks under her son's rule seemed on the verge of success. Still the contest went on till the death of Brunhilde, who was brutally done to death by Clotaire in 614, left the son of Fredegunda as sole ruler of the Frankish realm. In these long years of contest, the Merovingian kingdom gradually fell into three divisions: Austrasia, Neustria, and Burgundy. The first comprising the Teutonic lands of the east, the second the Latinized lands west of the Scheldt and Meuse, the last the lands farther south watered by the Rhone. The condition of Western Europe at this period is well summarized in Milman's History of Latin Christianity. It is difficult to conceive a more dark and odious state of society than that of France under the Merovingian kings, the descendants of Clovis, as described by Gregory of Tours. In the conflict or coalition of barbarism with Roman Christianity, barbarism had introduced into Christianity all its ferocity with none of its generosity or magnanimity. Its energy shows itself in atrocity of cruelty and even of sensuality. Throughout, assassinations, parricides, and fratricides intermingle with adulteries and rapes. That King Clotaire should burn alive his rebellious son with his wife and daughter is fearful enough, but we are astounded even in these days with a bishop of Tours burning a man alive to obtain the deeds of an estate which he coveted. Fredegunda sends 2 murderers to assassinate Childebert, and these assassins are clergymen. She causes the Archbishop of Rouen to be murdered while chanting the service in his church, and in this murder a bishop and an archdeacon are her accomplices. Marriage was a bond contracted and broken on the slightest occasion. Some of the Merovingian kings took as many wives, either together or in succession, as suited either their passion or their politics. Devastated by civil war, the lands of Western Europe also suffered in this 6th century the horrors of plague and hostile invasion. The chroniclers of the time are full of records of the superstitious terrors awakened by the pestilence that swept across Europe, striking down its victims by thousands, and appearing to the terrified eyes of men as a visible demon armed with a dart. And on the society disorganized by pestilence, wild tribes of Saxons, Huns, and other peoples broke, plundering and slaying. Unless there had arisen new leaders to defend the frontiers, Western Europe must have relapsed into barbarism and anarchy. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of the Dawn of Mediaeval Europe, 476 to 918, by J.H.B. Masterman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Justinian. The death of Theodoric coincides with the beginning of a revival in the empire under the great emperor Justinian. In 518, Anastasius the emperor died, and Justin, the commander of the Illyrian imperial guard, was selected by the soldiers as his successor. He was an Illyrian by race and had served in the armies of the empire for 50 years. His 9 years' rule as emperor was marked by few events of importance. He was illiterate and unaccustomed to civil business, and adopted his nephew Justinian, for whom he had provided a thorough education, as his colleague. On his death in 528, Justinian succeeded him as sole emperor. The empire of which Justinian now became undisputed master had been strengthened and enriched by 70 years of almost unbroken peace. Occasional frontier wars gave occupation to the army without seriously affecting the prosperity of the people, while an efficient body of officials conducted the administration. Justin, by his profession of orthodoxy, had closed a long-standing dispute between the emperors and the church authorities, and his nephew was therefore able to exercise autocratic authority both in church and state. Justinian had already shown himself an eager student of all departments of knowledge, and when he became his uncle's colleague, he quickly developed great powers of administration. His industry and grasp of affairs were the wonder of the court. Unemotional and pitiless, he ruled his empire with an unwearied diligence that left little time either for sleep or recreation. While deficient in the highest qualities of statesmanship, he was able and ambitious, and was well served by the officers whom he gathered around him, and to whom the carrying out of his schemes was entrusted. Before he became emperor, he had married Theodora, a woman of remarkable beauty and force of character, who had been a dancer at the theatre. Whatever her earlier life may have been, she appears after her marriage to have given no opportunity for scandal, and to have been forward in promoting charitable works. Soon after Justinian's accession to the throne, the celebrated Nika riots gave her the opportunity of showing her strength of will. Of the two factions in Constantinople, Justinian's dynasty was supported by the Blues, the Greens being generally hostile. Encouraged by the imperial patronage, the Blues appeared to have created something like a reign of terror in the city, till at last Justinian determined to assert his authority. An opportunity for doing so occurred in January 532, when a faction fight began in the city, which ended in the two factions joining together to attack the authorities. After some days of rioting, in the course of which a considerable part of the city was burnt, the people seized Hypatius, a nephew of Anastasius, and compelled him to be crowned as emperor. The fate of Justinian seemed to hang in the balance, and some of his ministers advised him to fly. But Theodora repudiated the suggestion with indignation, and declared that empire is a fair winding sheet. Emboldened by her words, the emperor determined to abide the issue. Belisarius, with all the troops that could be got together, was sent to attack the rioters, while Narses the chamberlain was sent to bribe the leaders of the Blues and sow disaffection between the allied factions. Belisarius marched to the hippodrome, where the people were assembled, and breaking in with his army began a massacre in which, it is said, about 35,000 people perished. The Blues and the Greens still went on and disturbed the peace of the city with their contests, but their political importance ceased after the great Nika sedition, and the throne of Justinian was never again menaced by their attacks. The reign of Justinian is notable especially for three things: his conquests, his laws, and his buildings. Justinian's great desire was to restore the ancient glories of the empire by reconquering the western provinces that had been lost to it in the previous century. The time was propitious for such an undertaking. The Teutonic kingdoms in the west were no longer ruled by their first conquerors, but by their degenerate descendants. And moreover, the Teutonic conquerors had not succeeded in winning the support of the Roman population in the lands that they had conquered. In Italy especially, they remained practically a garrison in a hostile country. The first of the western kingdoms to be reabsorbed was the Vandal kingdom of North Africa. There a Catholic king, Hilderic, was deposed by an Arian rival, Jalamir. The usurper met the protests of Justinian with insult, and in 533 Justinian equipped an expedition under the command of the great general Belisarius. The Roman fleet arrived after a protracted voyage to find the Vandals entirely unprepared for defence, and Belisarius marched to within 10 miles of Carthage before he met the army that the Vandal king had hastily collected. After a hard fight, the Vandal host was broken, and the victorious Romans entered Carthage amid the cheers of the provincial population, who welcomed the imperial army as their deliverers from the hated Vandal yoke. One more fight outside the walls of Carthage finally broke the power of the Vandals, and Belisarius came home in 534, bringing great spoils and the Vandal king as a captive to grace his triumph. Gelemir was generously treated by Justinian and allowed to live in Phrygia in comfort to the end of his life. North Africa became once more an imperial province. The story of the reconquest of Italy has been already told. It began with Belisarius' conquest of Sicily in 535 and ended with the victory of Narses in 552. Two Persian wars interrupted this campaign in the west. The first of these, lasting from 528 to 531, was the war in which Belisarius won his first laurels. It ended in an inconclusive peace. The second began in 540 and was due to the fear of the young Persian king Chosroes that as soon as Justinian's campaign in the west was over, he would turn eastwards and overwhelm the Persian power. Resolving to take the initiative, he marched into Syria and captured and sacked the great city of Antioch, the third city of the empire in wealth and splendour. Belisarius was recalled from the west to meet this new danger, and 3 years of indecisive contest followed, interrupted by the great plague that ravaged the whole east in 542. Soon after, Belisarius, falling into disgrace at court, was recalled, and the war dragged on for 2 years longer, ending in a 5 years' truce in 545. At the end of this time the war was renewed, the centre of contest being the district of Colchis on the shores of the Black Sea. At last, in 555, the Persians made peace, abandoning Colchis in return for a cash payment. The chief importance of these Persian wars in their bearing on European history was that they drained away the military and financial resources of the empire, and were among the causes that necessitated the heavy burden of taxation that Justinian laid upon his subjects. A large sum was also spent in subsidies to Hunnish and other barbarian tribes on the northern frontier to buy off their opposition, while the imperial armies were occupied with the Italian and Persian campaigns. But it was not only on war that the resources of the empire were expended. Justinian was a great builder. In all parts of the empire, churches, aqueducts, bridges, fortifications attested his wealth and energy. Supreme among his architectural triumphs stands the great church of St. Sophia in Constantinople, on the site of Constantine's Church of the Divine Wisdom, which had been twice destroyed by fire. Anthemius of Tralles was the architect of the new church, for the adornment of which the temples of Asia and Greece were plundered of their richest marbles and columns. When completed, it must have been a spectacle of unparalleled magnificence, with its great dome, in which the sunlight seemed to grow, its 100 columns, and its golden altar. St. Sophia became the model to the whole Eastern world for centuries, and remains still the greatest example of the Byzantine style of architecture. But of all the works of Justinian, that which exercised the greatest influence on after times was his codification of Roman law. After the establishment of the empire, the imperial constitutions, issued by the authority of the emperor, took the place of the leges passed in the comitia. From time to time these constitutions had been collected into codes, the last collection having been made in the time of Theodosius in 438. But since that time many fresh constitutions had been issued, and Justinian determined to set about the compilation of a new code that should be simpler and more complete than any yet issued. A commission of 10 men, of whom the Questor Tribunian was the most important, undertook the work in 528, and in the following year the Code of Justinian was published. This was followed by a much more difficult undertaking. Much of the Roman law was not in the form of constitutions, but in the form of opinions given by lawyers of recognized authority, responsa prudentum, as they were called, very much as English common law is based on verdicts given by judges in the past. These responsa had been collected in many large volumes, but they had never been arranged in any system, and often contradicted each other. Justinian determined to put this mass of material into order, and he appointed a new commission in 530 for that purpose. It took 17 lawyers 3 years to read through all the existing collections of responsa, eliminate contradictions and superfluous matter, and arrange the whole in one series of volumes. The code thus drawn up, known as the Digest or Pandex, became henceforth the recognized authority for Roman case law. Besides these two great works, Justinian issued a manual of the principles of Roman law in 4 volumes, especially for students, the Institutions. The administrative work of the empire was well conducted under Justinian, but all other functions of government were subordinated to the supreme necessity of raising funds for Justinian's wars and buildings, and the payment of the army of officials who conducted the administration of the provinces. Justinian's expedients for raising money were often discreditable. He is said to have sold offices, to have confiscated the property of private citizens, and once at least to have attempted to debase the coinage, an attempt only frustrated by a threat of insurrection. Much of Justinian's energies were spent over ecclesiastical controversies, into which there is no need for us to enter. He claimed the most autocratic authority over the Church in the empire, and wrote several treatises and letters on doctrinal questions. In December 565 Justinian died. His reign of nearly 40 years, while it restored Italy and North Africa to the empire for a time, had exhausted the eastern provinces that constituted the real strength of the empire. Even before his death there were ominous indications that the resources of the empire had been overtaxed, and almost immediately after his death the collapse of his system showed on how unsubstantial a foundation it rested. Had Justinian, instead of turning his ambitions westward, concentrated his attention to developing the defences of the eastern frontiers of the empire, the crescent flag of the prophet might never have waved over Jerusalem or Antioch, and the course of human history might have been different to a degree almost impossible to exaggerate. The latter half of the 6th century was a period of misfortune for the empire. The Persian War broke out again in the east, while the newly conquered lands in the west were overrun by fresh migrations of barbarians. Justin II, 565-578, who succeeded his uncle without opposition, declined to continue the subsidies that his predecessor had paid to the Persians and to the Avars and other tribes on the Danube. The result was that the empire became involved in a war with the